Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us for what promises to be a timely, interesting, and robust discussion. Before I start, I wanted to acknowledge, and I think I mentioned this on Tuesday, the difficult time we're in across our country. Our offices at MEC are just blocks away from the courthouse where the Chauvin trial occurred, and not far from where George Floyd was tragically murdered. And one of the things that has just kept coming back to me over and over this week is how important education is in terms of providing opportunities for people. It's a door opener. And I just think that having some education beyond high school, and I know you all support that too, is just creates this pathway to a robust, full, and hopefully happy life, right? And I was with a group this morning, actually, Dennis, with some of your folks in Minnesota, and I paused and I just said, it made me think about why I do what I do, and why do we all do what we do, right? I mean, Representative Murphy, you're the chair of a higher ed committee. You could be the chair of another committee, but education is really something that I'm guessing that you've chosen, or maybe it chose you or both. And so there's a reason why we do what we do, and why it's so important for our society, for our economy, and for every single person. So just a couple things before we get started, because I want to make sure we get to our key speakers today. Higher education is a critical element to getting our economies back up and growing, but it's also typically the place where legislatures and governors look to cut funds to fill other gaps. And I worked for 2 governors, so I can say that. And I also worked in Congress, and the same thing occurred. It's no different in our states, and I'm not casting blame. When the Gates and Lumina Foundations released their report, Higher Education Finance in the Post-COVID Era, I saw an opportunity to share the principles and strategies with our Midwestern states. We started with an interactive webinar on February 5th to simply share the report and guiding principles for higher education funding and explore which ones folks would be interested in rolling up their sleeves to dive in further. On Tuesday, just this week, we focused on the 4th principle, to expand and invest to drive economic growth. And if you weren't able to join, you'll find a link on our website with the materials and presentation attached. In today's discussion, we'll focus on the 3rd principle, to support programs and strategies that advance credential completion. We're very pleased to have Martha Snyder, Senior Director at HCM Strategists, facilitating today's discussion. HCM was the primary research and policy analyst on the Gates and Lumina reports, and they also support Lumina Strategy Labs, supporting this webinar learning series. We're grateful to our speakers and colleagues who join us today to discuss the great work happening in their states. President Jack Hershey from the Ohio Association of Community Colleges, and Jack is also one of our commissioners with the Compact, and Trustee Mario Carrera of Metropolitan State University in Denver, Colorado. Before handing things up to Martha to guide the way, just a few things. We'll spend about 35 minutes as a group learning about the principle and the efforts in Ohio and Colorado. Then we'll have a discussion as a group together to talk and get feedback on our efforts, maybe ideas, input from peers and colleagues from other states, and that will be facilitated as well. Our participants will remain muted through the first half of the presentation. If you can't mute yourself, Katie's great at that, so have no fear. And the session's being recorded. The recording and slides will be available on the MEC website after the event. Martha, I'm going to hand this off to you now, and I'd love you to introduce yourself, please. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Susan. Welcome, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to be with MEC again today. Appreciate the opportunity to have this series and build off of the report that Susan referenced. I am a senior director with HCM Strategists. In that role, particularly lead the firm's work on post-secondary finance issues, working with several of the colleagues in our organization. And I'm happy to talk with you today about the principles put forward in that report, but particularly Principle 3, and how states can implement policies and funding strategies to advance more equitable outcomes, but also credential completion. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I reside in Albany, New York, and it is more like a winter day here today than it is a spring day, which is just the the pleasures of living in robust upstate New York. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen and just walk through kind of some grounding of the report and the principles that we put forward. There we go. Can everybody give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Great. All right. So as Susan referenced, the report that was advanced or developed with Gates and Lumina really charged us as HCM, as Strategy Lab, supporting that work to address kind of some challenges that were put forward by COVID-19 and recognize that without a doubt, the impacts of COVID-19 and all of those documented effects from health to economic to educational opportunity and connectivity were connected in terms of both the historical and structural roots of higher education, but also all of the consequences of not providing equitable access to higher education across socioeconomic and demographic parameters. And with that, so therefore, how can states, as we navigate this recovery, certainly with an influx of federal stimulus and federal recovery dollars, how can states best target post-secondary investments to ensure a more sustained and equitable recovery? The report that was put forward, and again, this is certainly just a quick review of the report that was referenced on February 5th and earlier this week, but really elevated 5 primary principles with strategies underneath each of those for how states could implement these principles. The first is the need to prioritize funding to institutions that can best serve those populations most affected by COVID-19, that have historically done so, and that provide those more immediate learning and training pathways for these individuals. The second is to protect and expand need-based financial aid through increased or reallocated investment. We've seen many states do this in response to COVID-19, and certainly a portion of the institutional resources from the federal government is meant to address some of these financial needs of students in the form of emergency aid. The third principle is the one that we will focus on in particular today, but supporting programs and strategies that advance students' ability to complete credentials. There's a variety of ways that states do this, either directly through funding of specific pathways programs or through overall robust funding mechanisms and formulas that align with many of these best practices. The fourth was the focus of Tuesday's webinar facilitated by my colleague joining us today, Elizabeth Salinas, to expand resources and invest differently to drive economic growth. Certainly here focused heavily on the federal resources that are previously referenced, filtering into states and higher education systems. And finally, elevate and improve system and institutional cost structures. This gets at how states can support institutions to be more effective, coordinated, issues such as transfer policies, but also implementing other strategies that may lower costs, both for institutions, the state, as well as students. Do want to just reference, and this was again referenced on Tuesday, but I think it's important, though not a specific focus of our conversation today. We will get to it in terms of how it relates to Principle 3, but just the robust amount of money, significant amount of money that is flowing into states and directly to higher education. I won't do the specific breakdown, but certainly these provide opportunities, particularly in the form of the HERF, which are those resources going directly to higher education, as well as the GEAR dollars that were part of the first 2 stimulus. Those are directly targeted towards educational relief with discretion for how they are used at the gubernatorial level. But certainly the state resources, the $139 billion in the CARES Act, and the $220 billion in the most recent relief provide opportunities for states to invest more comprehensively in recovery, inclusive of post-secondary. So just sitting a little bit on principle 3, the focus of today's conversation, it really is about how states can support programs and strategies that advance students' ability to complete credentials. What are these specific investments or general investments and strategies that states can elevate and implement? We'll walk through several of these. I will highlight just a few, and then I will get into more specifics. Certainly the need to allocate resources in ways that protect access while also providing increased incentives or supports for institutions to expand student success strategies. Again, I will provide more detail on this, but this is something that we'll certainly get into in our conversation with Jack and Mario in terms of the overall funding formula that supports post-secondary institutions in those states or in states, and making sure that is aligned, that the incentives within those formulas are aligned to the implementation of student success pathways and strategies. We also see several states that are, again, directly funding career pathway programs that integrate wraparound services. Certainly a lot of focus recently on the need to use resources to provide access to technology and broadband. All of these things and all of these strategies support students' ability to complete credentials, particularly in this COVID environment. I do just want to reference, and we're not going to spend a lot of time here, but that principle 1 really cannot be devoid as you're implementing it from, or principle 3 from principle 1. Which is really the need for states to take a step back and look at how their resources are allocated across different types of institutions. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time here. We will get to it when Mario discusses the recent steps that Colorado took to reform their funding model. But recognizing that the overarching formulas or the overarching distribution models that go to institutions really sets the baseline for whether or not institutions can adequately support a diverse group of students that are necessary for a long-term sustained recovery. And this just provides kind of a breakdown of why this matters. When we look at the breakdown of different types of institutions and who they serve and the overall resources that they have, and particularly where they're getting those resources, we see those colleges and those community colleges and baccalaureate colleges much more reliant on state aid. And therefore that needs to be part of the conversation when we're having these overarching discussions. So just getting into some state efforts and some strategies. Again, we will get into many of these when we talk with Jack and Mario, but just providing some high level overview. We are going to talk about the formula models that align with student success efforts, commonly referred to as outcomes-based funding or student success funding, those direct investments in student supports, investments in career pathways, and then those opportunities to provide access to more learning opportunities through open resources and other such strategies. When we talk about student success funding, I am not going to I could give a whole webinar on student success funding, but I am not going to. Happy to at some point, but just wanted to kind of talk about, right, the student success funding are those overarching formulas, those distribution mechanisms for how the state allocates its core institutional supports to institutions. As you can see from this map, it is a very active policy environment nationally. I want to be very clear that not all of these funding models in terms of robustness, the orientation, the metrics involved are equal or the same. But just wanted to point out that there is a large majority of states that have some reflection of student success funding model in place. Again, components of well-designed funding models, a couple to highlight, they align with state goals and priorities, and certainly reward institutions for access, as well as success of all students, particularly with a focus on traditionally underserved student populations. In this case, though, that would directly align with those individuals most affected by COVID-19. Talked about, the need for states to directly invest in programs or pathways that integrate wraparound services. One such strategy, and this is certainly something that states could look into as a way to potentially use those federal dollars, is to set up some sort of CUNY-like ASAP program and use those resources to begin to model out what a program would look like in their state. This program, again, is pretty nationally known, and certainly, as you can see here, Ohio replicated it, and Jack could probably talk a little bit to the experience of the colleges that engaged in the modeling or the recasting of the CUNY ASAP program. But this program is an innovative model. It provides Metro cards to individuals. Obviously, that may or may not be relevant depending on the state that you're in, but in CUNY in New York City, it is very relevant, providing access to transportational resources. It provides financial assistance to cover tuition and textbook assistance, integrated advisor and registration support, and really a network or community cohort model. So the students are with each other throughout their experience. You can see the outcomes here are tremendous in terms of 3-year graduation rate is 52%, which is more than double of the 24.6% of those not involved in the CUNY ASAP program. And then the cost is an interesting one. Here, the $6,000 per degree savings is due to higher completion. When you look at this as a per FTE basis, it appears as though it's higher cost, but the ROI of such a model is certainly present. The Virginia Community College Fast Forward program, again, is another one that provides training for jobs in high demand fields. It is a low cost program. Average cost to students out of pocket cost is $1,100. Provides various financial aid resources to help offset those costs. The program takes 6 to 12 weeks and again has a 90% completion rate. Some other features of this program are that the students are supported by a coach to help them navigate through from entry into ideally a job, but through the career finding pathway. And then some programs embed internships and externships before students graduate. So again, kind of aligned to best practices in terms of success for students. Several of the programs have guaranteed interview agreements. So a very soup to nuts, robust training program that Virginia, the community colleges in Virginia have found great success with, and have even been able to navigate some of the realities of COVID-19 in terms of the hands-on training that is often embedded within these programs. And then just a couple of additional examples that we wanted to provide you with. This is particularly using GEAR dollars in ways that are directly targeting student success and credential completion. Texas allocated about $10 million of their CARES to improve the quality of online learning, creating open educational resource materials for students. And really strengthening the distance education offerings and institutions' capabilities to use student success strategies in a virtual environment. So online advising and those types of things. Georgia used their GEAR dollars to create a competitive grant to support accelerated learning opportunities and other types of integrations or other types of supports for students, particularly in response to COVID-19. You'll see that the program must use data to target student populations with specific backgrounds, again, those particularly affected by the pandemic. And the requirement that this embed an evaluation to evaluate continuous improvement and effective implementation. So the results are not out yet on these two investments, but certainly some tangible ideas for states to consider as they're trying to understand how best to invest in ways that can foster student credential completion and more equitable outcomes. So with that as just general introduction, this is a quote I pulled from the report that was earlier referenced, but just the reality that without a system of financing that fundamentally shifts how we invest in higher education and is explicitly focused on the need to serve those but most affected by COVID-19, but even those that weren't participating prior to COVID-19 is fundamental to ensuring a more equitable and sustainable economic recovery. So I want to transition us to with just that as general overview, general context setting about what this principle means and how states could potentially elevate and implement it, to invite Jack and Mario into the conversation. Susan gave a brief introduction of each of them, but I want to just reintroduce them as we get started here. Mario Carrera, as referenced, is a trustee of the Metropolitan State University in Denver. I will let him talk a little bit about what Metro State is and who they serve as we're talking about the formula adjustments that the state recently made and why that matters. But Mario is also a senior executive in media sales, television, radio, and online property, so has a wide variety of expertise and information in formulation of company strategies, plans, and objectives. So thank you, Mario, for being with us. Jack Hershey is, again, as referenced, President and CEO of the Ohio Association of Community Colleges, which represents the presidents and trustees of the state's 23 community colleges. Prior to joining OACC, Jack was with the Ohio State University, where at that time, he helped to collaborate across all state colleges and universities to provide a unified funding approach for both capital and operating budgets, of which we will get to in particular in just a moment. So with that as introduction, Jack, I just want to kind of start with you. And, even prior to COVID-19, where one of the strategies that I referenced, which is a broader strategy beyond just COVID-19, is the idea of states evaluating the funding model that they have in place, the core funding model that they have for how they distribute resources to institutions. Ohio is, certainly a state that has been implementing such a funding model for several years now. So can you share just generally how this funding model came to be, how it's advanced student success and completion at campuses, and if the focus of the funding model has shifted at all in response to COVID?
Sure. Thank you, Martha. And thank you, Susan, for the opportunity to talk about this today. I specifically thank you for asking how it came to be, because I think it's one of the most important portions and least told portions of our story of moving to 100% outcome-based funding. And it started when our past governor, John Kasich, called every community college and university president together in a room with the state's chancellor and his team, and basically said, I would like to see the state move in the direction of incentivizing more completion. And then he sort of famously, in our world, kicked the chancellor and his team out of the room and said, you are not involved in this going forward. I want the presidents in charge of this. I want them to come back and recommend something to me. And he gave us no other guidelines other than that. And I think that's important, from a leadership standpoint, and that, the governor never put any of the presidents in a position to oppose his position. So they weren't out there saying this is going to be terrible for us, and then it passes, and then have to come back onto their campus and say, hey, this is a good thing, and we should embrace it. They were on board from the beginning and sort of saying, okay, well, if we're going to do this and change our funding model, what do we want to become? What do we want to do at our colleges, and how do we incentivize ourselves to do that better? And so Ohio was one of the early states in sort of the college completion movement through investments from the Gates Foundation and other. We were completion by design state. I think a handful of our colleges learned a lot from that. And the other presidents were like, well, let's embrace that this works. And so we redesigned our funding model to incentivize the behaviors that we saw that were working in some of these early completion metrics. The governor never told us to go to 100% funding. He never gave us a target at all. To be quite honest with you, they were surprised when the presidents came back and recommended 100%. But what the presidents came back with was, if we want to sell change on our campus and increase our completion, we've got to make this formula somewhat simple to explain to people, and they've got to understand. Now that's impossible, right? You can't make government funding formulas simple, but from a presidential level and a leadership level, it was simple. It was 100% of our funding from the state only flows to us now if we get people through to completion. And it didn't really matter who you were on the campus, you got it. You're right. You got that our state funding now came, and that this was our goal, was to get people to completion. So we put a formula in place. In big picture, it puts 50% of our funding comes to us when students complete a course. 25% comes to us when they complete, they finish their degree or transfer to a university. And then 25% is there for completion milestones, the spots along the way where we can see students making good progress. And that was it. There's a lot of, there's a lot of details under it. On top of that framework, we layered 4 access factors for students who we had done the data showed weren't completing at the same rate as the overall student body. And so that is age, low income status, whether they were Pell eligible ever, minority students, and whether they came in academically unprepared for us through some testing mechanisms. You know, I will say before we transition to what's happening now, you know, we put this in place in 2015, the first time. We worked on it for like a year beforehand, so people had a chance to review it. We have seen a 25% increase in the amount of credentials that we have awarded since we've put this formula into place. And to put it in context, right, that is historic highs. We have never seen that many completions out of our system, and we are nowhere near the historical highs in terms of enrollment in the community college sector in Ohio. So we're actually fairly low. So we've got low enrollment that got even lower during COVID, and yet, you know, this broad framework that didn't have a lot of policy behind it other than to say do this was implemented well by the presidents. Now, the one change that we have made in relationship to COVID, which, by the way, changing a funding formula in the midst of the uncertainty of COVID is maybe not recommended, but we had this sort of nagging thing in our formula that always drove a lot of people nuts, which was that we gave one of the success points to people when you would get somebody through developmental education and then enroll them in the college course. And that's not where the research suggests is the right thing to do anymore. The right thing to do is to put them in a co-requisite model and put them in the college course and give them additional wraparound services. But our formula was backwards, and it was penalizing people who were doing the right thing and rewarding those who were dragging their feet. So we have now changed our funding formula. We made the recommendation at the end of last calendar year. It's been proposed and supported by both the governor and the House so far. And our new success metric is that you would get through your entry-level college and English courses within the first 30 credit hours you take. So within the first year, you get through those entry-level English and math, which, you know, the data suggests completion rates increase significantly once you get through there.
Thanks, Jack. And I think just that the removal of that criteria in the context of COVID is not only, you know, it's aligned with best practice, but particularly given what we anticipate to be, you know, significant or potential learning losses for students or challenges as students transition from high school to college. Certainly making sure that those co-requisite models are incented is perhaps even more relevant in this particular moment. So Mario, I want to turn to you just to provide some context for Colorado. I know that post-secondary finance has been a very active conversation in this year's budget and legislative sessions, and particularly including the development of a new funding model, one that we would probably argue is more equitable. Can you provide some perspective on the steps that led to this reform? And certainly what was some of the rationale or case making for such a reform from the perspective of MSU Denver?
Thank you, Martha. And yes, thank you, Susan and Jack. It was really enlightening to hear where Ohio is and the kind of growth that's taken place since Governor Kasich put that in place. And before I start, actually, I'd like to give a shout out to my fellow trustee who I know was in the group, Kristen. Glad to see you there. Please feel free to chime in if I'm short on a few details here. Martha, in response to your question, there are several things to touch on to provide some perspective and context to the question. So like Susan started by saying, it's not an understatement really to recognize that this last year has brought quite a few challenges to the forefront of our country, including in higher education. MSU Denver, your first question, I should kind of give you some background, is a university that is the third largest in the state of Colorado. 95% of our students are from Colorado. 57% are first generation and 47% are students of color, and 32% happen to be of Latino background, which makes us a Hispanic serving institution. We're designated for the second year just this last year. So we're excited about continuing with that and going through with it. So that's the background as far as the kind of institution that we are and the trajectory that we've had. The university in and of itself has had equity as a historic operating value. In fact, this is a key and fundamental reason for my interest in serving as a trustee. And because of the inequities that were further illuminated by the pandemic and its health and economic impacts, as well as the reawakening that we've seen in the need for racial justice, a lot of the university leadership, including the trustees, urgently recommitted to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. In addition to board-led sessions and a very exhaustive strategic planning process that included specific goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion, our trustees and our senior leaders also took this values-based lens and focused on it, our core operating decisions, including our annual state funding request when we came to the legislature. But just like in many other states across the country, Colorado's workforce needs are rapidly evolving, and economic mobility, we know, that requires some kind of degree or certificate. And employers are increasingly interested in seeing their workforce reflect the diversity of the state. So we simply believe that higher ed must be responsive to those needs. And while we saw that the legislature was well attuned to our workforce needs and established specific goals around degree attainment and eliminating race and ethnicity equity gaps in certificate and degree completion that were responsive to these workforce demands, what we found was that the historic approach to higher ed funding was not aligned with those goals. And this is something that I'm sure people are very comfortable or knowledgeable on, and it's not uncommon. And it's unfortunate that there are many significant gaps in base funds provided to universities that are serving students of color. And pro rata, the approach to funding increases were further expanding that inequity. I think I read that the Center for American Progress actually has the spending gaps on a national level at approximately 5 billion less in educating students of color in 1 year than they do in educating white students. So our respective deficit here in Colorado for parity with MSU, specifically with a sponsored Hanover report from the Colorado Department of Higher Education, that number was actually $64 million for MSU Denver, and lack of support in bringing us to parity. So with this renewed and urgent commitment to pursuing equity in our work, it became clear that standing by the historic status quo in Colorado's approach to higher ed funding was just no longer possible. Our president, Dr. Janine Davidson, with the support and the encouragement of our entire board of trustees, took the bold step earlier this year to stand up and engage legislators in conversations around how our state higher ed budget can both be better aligned to our state's attainment goals and reflect the values of equity that we all share. We were fortunate actually to be a part of a broad coalition. This was kind of something that simmered and was shared across different institutions beyond higher ed. And that coalition actually included groups that were advocating for economic mobility, health outcomes, and social justice groups, all that basically recognize that higher ed has a core role in advancing the state as a place for everyone to have the opportunity to live vibrant, stable lives. So through this collaborative approach, there were key champions that stood out in this partnership and in the Joint Budget Committee with the legislature, namely one that actually stood out, Representative Leslie Herod, who she heard our perspective loud and clear and joined us in crafting a new creative approach that better aligns to our state's values and goals. And I should actually say that this legislature and the Joint Budget Committee itself is among the most diverse in the history of Colorado. Representative Herod is the first Black woman in the Joint Budget Committee since the House, representing the House actually, and since 1986. And the chair, Senator Dominic Moreno, is the first Latino to be chairing the Joint Budget Committee. So we were thrilled with the Joint Budget Committee proposed new allocation and the base funds to public universities that came out of that. They were based on the enrollment of students of color, first generation students and Pell eligible students, as well as the retention of students of color in its budget for next year. So this proposal was just recently affirmed by the legislature just last week and is an important first step toward ensuring that the universities actually have an opportunity to deliver on this skilled workforce to meet employer demands and have the resources to do just that.
Thank you, Mario. And I certainly want to get into a little bit more of the details of the funding model. One of the so yeah, Susan, I can ask your question right now. Was the support for your work bipartisan in terms of taking steps towards implementing these new funding models back in 2015, Jack, and most recently Mario?
For us, it was bipartisan, largely because the governor requested that every college and university president sign on to the plan. So when we submitted our plan, we had every signature on it, and that, for the politicians, and I think that eases a lot of problems when higher education can speak with one unified voice. Things tend to become bipartisan at that point.
Yeah, in Joint Budget Committee, there are 6 that take up and make up the committee. 4 of them are Democrats and 2 of them are Republican, just because of the weight of just where the legislature is right now in terms of representation. The vote on that came down with 5-1, 5 actually supporting and 1 against. The 1 was Republican, so it was bipartisan in that we had one of the Republicans supporting that. The Senate just voted on the draft, and that was overwhelmingly bipartisan. 32 actually voted in favor and 1 voted against out of a 35 member Senate. So very significant. And the House was 42, was more partisan in the draft of that budget, with 42 all Democrat and 23 all Republican. But the final draft of that budget will actually probably give us more of a bipartisan color on it overall.
Yeah, and we can certainly talk about the bipartisanship and the formula itself in terms of the way that it's framed. But I do want to be cognizant of time and want to certainly shift a little bit to the resources, the federal resources that are flowing into the system, into institutions and states. And in some cases, we've seen state policymakers begin to make the case that these resources mean that the state can hold steady on their investments in higher ed, or even pull back on their own level of current investments. So how can we instead, Jack, I'm curious, your case for making sure that states maintain their own investment while also leveraging these federal resources to advance student success and economic development, and how those conversations are or are not playing out in Ohio?
Yeah, sure, Martha. One part of my introduction is that I used to work for the state budget office as well before I was in higher education. So, I would say this, a year ago, Ohio had a 17% unemployment rate. We're at 5% today, right? I mean, from workforce standpoint, we have recovered from COVID. Matter of fact, we might be worse off, right? I mean, because we have this narrative out there that people aren't returning to work because they're making too much money from federal stimulus payments. I don't know the degree that that's true or not, but it's out there anecdotally, and we hear it a lot. The point we've tried to make to the state, and Ohio's share, I think, is going to be $5.6 billion that we're going to receive. If I put my old budget hat on, man, that is a lot of money for the state to receive at one point. And at least in our state, the state leaders have been pretty committed to using it only for one-time purposes, and to not build ongoing expenses with these one-time funds. So the case we've tried to make, we have a proposal, it's called Rapid ROI. We've tried to go to state leaders and say, you can recoup some of that money back into your own coffers if we focus on individuals who could complete a certificate or a credential in a very short period of time, in a year or less, and we can get them into the workforce. That means they're paying taxes back, and so you are going to be able to recoup some of that money back to you. We've had a couple colleges play around with it because they've had little pots of money here or there, and they've been trying literally everything to increase enrollment during COVID times. I had a call with my presidents right before this. The one area where there is optimism in enrollment in community colleges is in short-term credential-based training programs. We think the people who need those, they need a job first, and they can't think about much else besides that at this point. So for state leaders, I think it's a compelling argument. It's trying to get the people back into the system who stopped out during COVID, because I think we all know through data, the longer they stay out, the less likely they are to eventually complete. And it's also a very quick turnaround, so that even within, Ohio budget's on a 2-year basis. So even within our current budget cycle, if you spent some of this money helping students pay for the costs of pursuing these programs, the state could start to recoup some of that through tax collections within the same year. Martha, we face all the same. We have legislators who feel the same way as you said at the beginning about maybe this is a case to cut back. That stopped for us fairly quickly, just because there's so much money out there that the idea of cutting doesn't seem to be taking a lot of priority right now. And what we continue to hear is the voice again from the business community of, we cannot find any people to hire. We cannot grow. We cannot expand. We need people. And so, I will finish with this. The one that I use as the anecdote, Ohio is a logistics state, because we're in between the East Coast and Chicago. And so we ship a lot of things to everywhere. We've had a truck driver shortage for as long as I can remember. And I can take in about 4 or 5 weeks somebody off of minimum wage and have them earning $60,000 and be home at night, every night. It costs $4,000 maybe. I mean, that from a state perspective, you should do everything you can to try and get those people through those quick training programs employed and becoming taxpayers as soon as possible. That's the way we've at least tried to argue it. I don't have the results yet to tell you if we've been successful, but we're working on it.
Jack, Mari, I want to just turn back to you in terms of as a trustee of an institution and someone who's likely engaged or working with your institutional leadership on how best to use these dollars, or how to advocate for the state to use these investments in a targeted and strategic way. Can you talk a little bit about what those conversations might be, and what some strategies might be that you're working to prioritize investment?
Yeah, it's really an important question, and without a doubt, the federal resources that have been made available to universities and our students have been really necessary. We're grateful for what those resources really have allowed us to do in response to the just extraordinary needs that have come to light over the last year. But like you framed it in the first question, this is not the time to pull back or hold steady. In light of the amount of money that's available. Over the last few weeks, I understand many members of our own legislature were referring to the state budget as a moral document. And to me, I say, of course it is. Our state budget is a direct reflection of what and who we value. So everything that we channel the resources to really says quite a lot about where we stand and what we want to see flourish. Specifically, because these resources, we have been able to invest in things like our IT infrastructure and our mental health support services, both which have been understandably under considerable strain given what we're going through. So we have been able to support critical auxiliary programs and such as our campus health center and remain, really essential for our students once we return to campus. But right now, without any foot traffic, it's really a struggling kind of organization. However, much like the federal dollars, these are one-time investments that yield wonderful long-term impacts for our students, and what is left in the balance are the ongoing persistent needs that require sustained yearly investments. To me, I'm sure to many of you, it is clear that higher education can be a very powerful tool to start addressing and prioritizing many of the inequities that we face in underrepresented communities. And we have a lot of work to do there. So I don't think learning beyond high school is going to guarantee that it's going to solve any issues of employment discrimination or wealth accumulation, but closing the gaps in educational spending is at least a good way to get going and started in providing people a high quality education. So it's investments in advising services, career navigators, faculty for emerging academic programs and the like are only made possible when you have reliable annual funds available. And strategic investments are key. I think the institutional budget should have funds to increase diversity and inclusion in all aspects of the institution. And we should rightly so ask, are the demographics of the institution reflecting that of the state? How about the incoming class? Are there gaps in academic achievement by race, ethnicity, and for low-income students? And what are we doing to close those gaps? And I think we should also be asking similar questions with respect to faculty and staff diversity, retention, and tenure promotion. So the federal stimulus has really played an extraordinary role in our ability to weather the storm of the last year, but the state is still essential in supporting those ongoing needs for all the universities and ensuring our students have dynamic and enriching educational experience that supports them in reaching the goals and the aspirations that they have. And in the final analysis, also growing our middle class and improving our economy that way. So in short, we need both.
Thanks, Mario. Jack, I want to turn back to you just as, from the role that you play as president of an association and obviously directly integrated with the president in terms of how the institutions, the institutions that you work with, the colleges, are anticipating leveraging these resources, the resources that have gone directly to them. Do you have any insights in terms of how they're using them? Is there coordination or efforts to coordinate, efforts to best understand how to spend these dollars in an effective way?
Yeah, Martha, I think there's informal coordination, not formal, but and the informal is, I think our pre-COVID, all of our officer groups met once a month in person to sort of coordinate things, talk about stuff. We're averaging 2 to 3 times a month now, and so and almost every call starts with, okay, who's gotten any new information on federal guidance on what we can and can't spend things on, because it's always changing. So I see that as one that the one that I wasn't going to talk about because I didn't know you were going to mention CUNY ASAP at the beginning, but we are thinking through the ASAP model again, right? I mean, we had 3 colleges go through through a pilot project to try to replicate what City University of New York did, and we replicated exactly. We saw the exact same results out of it. The 3 colleges who did it they're bigger urban colleges. They're fairly well resourced within our world, and they all sort of said this is way too expensive to continue on. And so they've taken portions of it, but not moved forward. I think part of it is what we learned was important out of that. We thought when we were doing CUNY ASAP, you're taking somebody who is part-time and asking them to go full-time. In exchange, you're paying their full tuition, you're paying their full books, and you're giving them some spending money every month, right? So we don't have a transportation system here. We gave them a card for gas and groceries. And then we sat through some focus groups at the end with people who'd gone through it. And, it was telling to us not a single person ever mentioned the financial benefits of the program when they talked about what it did. Instead, you'd hear, there's one person I still remember that she said, she's like, I like the program. I thought it was too good to be true when they first told me about it. She's like, I tried to quit 3 times while I was in it because too much was happening in my life. And so somebody asked, well, why? And she was like, because she pointed to her advisor, who's part of the program, who she was mandated to see every week, and said she would not let me. Pointed right to her. She wouldn't let me. So of all the financial stuff in there, it was that holistic advising of seeing somebody who really cared about her academic progress and believed in her and said that you can get through this, and no matter what you've got going on, don't drop out of a class. That sort of infrastructure is what those 3 colleges are still trying to replicate. They're doing with smaller cohorts than they were before, but they're still trying to replicate it. The beauty of how it could work with the federal resources is CUNY would say to you, there's one-time upfront cost to get this started. You've got to hire all of these advisors. You've got to bring them in. You've got to set up the structure for it. But within a handful of years, your graduation rates have doubled. Your students are staying with you longer. So the amount of tuition dollars you are generating more than pays for the initial investment. And so it's that, it's, to us, it was such a big price tag that we couldn't have even imagined at the time going to the state and asking for the amount of money it would have taken to replicate the CUNY ASAP model here. But now, we might have this once in a lifetime opportunity to move the needle on some of this stuff.
Thank you, everybody. I am now going to get in the car and head to Wisconsin to see our son. So have a great afternoon, and I'm grateful to all of you. Thank you.